vacuum, and from these to the newspapers in the War Department came the hundreds of plans, nearly all of them entirely fantastic, for conquering an enemy now unassailably entrenched. But while pessimism and lassitude governed the United States, the intruders were taking energetic measures to increase their successes. "I have been present at the questioning of 2 spies," reported General Thario, "and I want to tell you the enemy is not going to miss a single opportunity, unlike ourselves. What they have in mind, I cannot guess. They can't fly over the grass any more than we can, as long as they want to conciliate world opinion, and I doubt if they can tunnel under it, but that they intend to do something is beyond question." Often the obvious course is the surprising one. Since the Russians couldn't go over or under the grass, they decided to march on top of it. They had heard of our pre-war snowshoe excursions on its surface, and so they equipped a vast army with this clumsy footgear and set it in motion with supply trains on wide skis pulled by the men themselves. Russian ingenuity, boasted the Kremlin, would succeed in conquering the grass where the decadent imperialists had failed. It is unbelievable. You might even call it absurd, but at least they are doing something, not sitting twiddling their thumbs. My men would give 6 months' pay to be as active as the enemy. To be sure, they are grotesque and inefficient. So was the army of Italy. Imagine sending an army, or armies if our reports are correct, on a 600-mile march without an air force, without artillery, without any mechanized equipment whatsoever. Unless, like the army of Italy, they have a Bonaparte concealed behind their lunacy, they have no chance at all of success. But by the military genius of Joseph Eggleston Johnston, if I were a younger man and not an American, I would like to be with them just for the fun they are having. By its very nature, the expedition was composed exclusively of infantry divisions carrying the latest type of automatic rifle. The field commissaries, the ambulances, the baggage trains had to be cut to the barest minimum, and General Thario wrote that evidently because of the impossibility of taking along artillery, the enemy had also abandoned their light and heavy machine guns. Against this determined threat, behind the wall of the Rockies, the American army waited with field artillery, railway guns, bazookas, and flamethrowers. For the first time, there was belief in a Russian defeat, if not an eventual American victory. But the waiting Americans were not to be given the opportunity for hand-to-hand combat. Since planes could not report the progress of the snowshoers over the grass, dirigibles and free balloons drifting with the wind gave minute-to-minute reports. Though many of the airships were shot down, and many more of the balloons blown helplessly out of the area, enough returned to give a picture of the rapid disintegration of the invading force. Nothing like it had happened to an army since 1812. The snowshoes, adequate enough for short excursions over the edge of the grass, became suicidal instruments on a march of weeks. Starting eastward from their bases in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, in military formation, singing triumphantly in minor keys, the Slavic steamroller had presented an imposing sight. Americans in the occupied area, seeing column after column of closely packed soldiers tramping endlessly up and over the grass, said it reminded them of old prints of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. The first day's march went well enough, though it covered no more than a few miles. At night they camped upon great squares of tarpaulin, and in the morning resumed their web-footed way. But the night had not proved restful, for over the edges of every tarpaulin the eager grass had thrust impatient runners, and when the time came to decamp, more than half the canvases had been left in possession of the weed. The second day's progress was slower than the first, and it was clear to the observers the men were tiring unduly. More than one threw away his rifle to make the marching easier. Some freed themselves of their snowshoes, and so, after a few yards, sank, inextricably tangled into the grass. Others lay down exhausted to rise no more. The men in the balloons could see by the way the feet were raised that the inquisitive Stolons were more and more entangling themselves in the webbing. Still, the Soviet command poured fresh troops onto the grass. Profiting perhaps by the American example, they transported new supplies to the army by dirigibles, replacing the lost tarpaulins and rifles, daringly sending whole divisions of snowshoers by parachute almost to the eastern edge. This last experiment proved too reckless, for enough of these adventurers were located to permit their annihilation by long-range artillery. "Their endurance is incredible, magnificent," eulogized General Thario enthusiastically. "They are contending not only with the prospect of meeting fresh, unworn troops on our side, but against a tireless enemy who cannot be awed or hurt, and even more against their own feelings of fear and despair, which must come upon them constantly as they get farther into this green desert, farther from natural surroundings, deeper into the silence and mystery of the abnormal barrier they have undertaken to cross. They are Supermen, and only supernatural means will defeat them." But there was plenty of evidence that the general credited the foe with a stronger spirit than they possessed. Their spirit was undoubtedly high, but it could not stand up against the relentless harassment of the grass. The weary, sodden advance went on, slower and slower, the toll higher and higher. There were signs of dissatisfaction, mutiny, and madness. Some units turned about to be shot down by those behind. Some wandered off helplessly until lost forever. The dwindling of the great army accelerated. Airborne replacements dependent on such erratic transport failed to fill the gaps. The marchers no longer fired at the airships overhead. They moved their feet slowly, hopelessly, stood stock-still for hours, or faltered aimlessly. Occasional improvised white flags could be seen, held apathetically up toward the balloonists. Long after their brave start, the crazed and starving survivors began trickling into the American lines where they surrendered. They were dull and listless, except for one strange manifestation. They shied away fearfully from every living plant or growth, but did they see a bare patch of soil, a boulder, or stretch of sand, they clutched, kissed, mumbled, and wept over it in a very frenzy. End of Chapter 4, Part E.